everyone, to the first session, the role of green technologies in achieving net zero. Just by way of housekeeping, as was mentioned, we've got about 5 minutes at the end of the session to take questions from the audience, but if you could do so through the Slido function that was mentioned, then the City of London Corporation will pick some questions that I will be able to ask our panel. It's 5 years ago this month that I signed net zero into law as Energy Minister. And I think if you told me then back in 2019, some of those technological opportunities that are now available, I simply wouldn't have believed you. I also wouldn't have believed you when you look at now the learning cost of some technologies, whether in solar, wind, battery storage power, that are coming down, enabling us to see an exponential growth in renewable power to try and hit that trebling of renewables target that was mentioned in the speech earlier. We have a fantastic panel today representing both public and private sector who are going to reflect not just on those opportunities that green technology can deliver. After all, if we're going to meet net zero, both the International Energy Authority and the UNCCC have recognized the importance in knowing that the technologies we have today will only get us halfway there, and we need to also be thinking about developing the technologies of tomorrow. But we're here in the beating heart of private capital in the UK, and that question about how we can enable and support those companies and organizations to be able to deliver the technologies on the ground is equally critical. I had an opportunity to deliver the independent net zero review for the UK government, and I went around the whole of the UK to every devolved nation, talking to businesses and organizations about what was needed. And it struck me then that the challenge is not the technologies and the businesses and companies that are raring to go, it's access to that private capital, the ability to be able to expand and deliver on the commitments they want to make and know that they can make. And how can we unlock those markets, both public and private? So these are some of the points of discussion that we'll be having today. I'd like to thank the panel for their time today. We're going to start by sort of reflecting actually on COP28 and recent sort of commitments made as part of the Dubai Climate Pact. COP28 ended with an agreement to accelerate a number of green technologies. Someone's mentioned the speech earlier, but obviously we've got focuses on hydrogen, nuclear, and CCUS in particular. But I'm keen to ask the panel, how has the role of green tech been profiled recently in international moments, and how has this changed in particular over recent years? And I'm going to turn to Heather first from the US Embassy. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I think I couldn't say it any better than your words and the keynote speaker's words when we're looking at all the different technologies that are now acknowledged by our multilateral forum to be part of the solution. I think in the last several years, we've expanded kind of our tunnel vision on renewables are the only way, and looked at our present context, the structures that are already in process, and said, how can we use technology to make that better? We see nuclear energy having a role at COP in recent years and coming to the table. So I think that kind of expanding how we get to our climate goals has been something that's changed recently. We have the International Energy Agency, which provides data on these technologies, and I think their latest analysis is that 6 of their 46 that they profile are commercially ready to go if people want to implement them. So I think that's a change, that these number of technologies that are available go up. We come together as like-minded nations within things like IEA and G7, and then we use things like the COP and the G20 to kind of spur both all kinds of nations to commit to climate goals. And then we have the Clean Energy Ministerial and Mission Innovation, which is really the implementing arm, where we bring together governments at the highest level along with organizations and the private sector to be that implementing arm. And I do think it's that bringing together of policy, academia, and financiers that's really going to get us towards our goals.
Thank you. One of the key challenges for green technologies is de-risking those technologies for wider markets. Rowan, if I could turn to you, someone who works and engages on de-risking markets, to the role of the insurance sector. Where do you see the role of insurance in particular in research and development for ultimately getting green technologies and the transition off the ground? How can we ensure that when it comes to looking at technologies that are yet to be developed, how do you create an enabling mechanism by underwriting what needs to happen?
Sure. Well, I think there's a massive role for the insurance and reinsurance sector and wider risk capital markets, actually. In fact, in about 3 weeks' time here in the Mansion House, to kick off Climate Week, there's going to be the first climate de-risking summit, which was really inspired by what happened in COP last year and the growing realization that we need to sort of awaken the sleeping giant of insurance, not just as an industry, but as an institution of society. And I think later in the panel we'll talk about its particular role in the capital stack at the very foundation of that. But I suppose to sort of to set the scene, we almost need to go back in history and understand how insurance has been at the fundamental substrate of managing these industrial revolutions in the past. So we could have been meeting here at Mansion House, I guess, 200 years ago, and instead of climate, we'd have been talking about steam and steam boilers, which were the AI of the time. They were everywhere, in locomotion, in factories, in buildings, but they were incredibly dangerous, and they blew up, and they killed people, and investors lost fortunes. And eventually in the 1850s in America and here in Europe, engineers and insurers got together to create the standards for safe boilers, both the boilers and how they fitted together, how you organize the plumbing. And that then enabled credit and investment to flow. And then that created this massive sort of growth in the industrialization. So that's the equivalent now of the net zero transition. How we're going to, it's not just about new technologies actually, Chris, it's about how we scale technology which has now reached pilot stage into mass adoption. So that was the net zero transition. Then we needed the resilient transition, because after that you had massive cities growing because of urbanization, industrialization. They burnt in the 1870s, 1880s, massive problems. Investors lost fortunes, banks lost fortunes. They needed insurance. Insurance said, well, you can have insurance, but you also need building codes and zoning laws and fire departments. And the relationship between insurance and governance made cities safe. Urban morphology in Europe and America was changed so that by the 1920s, fire was almost forgotten. So then you had mass urbanization, and then you had the need for a just transition, because all the social fabric had broken down. Families had migrated from rural communities, from their networks, leading incredibly precarious lives. So then you had the political revolution of social insurance. It was the very essence of politics. You had it Bismarck in Germany, Churchill and Lloyd George here in the UK at the turn of the last century, FDR, Beveridge, Attlee. The recognition that to have an effective industrial transition, you needed a social platform that created security. So we learned an insurance revolution in 100 years between 1850 and 1950. If we are going to have a successful climate transition in an emergency in just 2 or 3 short decades, we need to relearn these forgotten lessons. And it's so exciting that here we've got an event sponsored by LIBA, the International Insurance Brokers Association. There's quite a few potential hecklers in the room for me from the insurance world over there. Finally, this sector is coming to be mainstream, not least through our work supported by the SMI. So lots more to discuss, but it's so exciting that at last in the climate zone and in the financial sector, insurance has been seen as being the critical missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle to speed and scale the technology transition.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. John, if I can turn to you from Breakthrough Energy, obviously your organisation's focus has been on looking at how to develop some of these nascent and emerging new technologies. The reality of the energy transition is we all desperately want to reduce emissions as soon as possible using all the tools we have, but some of those tools might break and fail. And how do you deal with the challenge of recognising that maybe some technological paths won't be the right ones, and how can we still persuade investors to make that sort of capital investment while we learn the lessons, what's needed to be learned?
Sure, thanks, Chris. Just briefly on breakthrough energy, we were established in Paris COP by Bill Gates in 2015. We have a series of funds right from early pre-seed all the way up to Series B and beyond. But all projects will involve a degree of risk, and I think clearly some projects will fail, some projects will succeed. At Breakthrough Energy, we currently have over 110 startups and scale-ups in what we call our ventures program, which is around Series A, Series B funding, and that's across a wide range of different energy projects and sectors. So from clean electricity, making low-carbon cement, low-carbon steel, and producing green hydrogen. And we know, given the pace of transition and scale we need to take many shots on goal to achieve this. But it's just not about proving technology, it's about then how you scale up ultimately to move the dial. And I think in terms of how you create a more sustainable ecosystem, I think that is key, and it needs a genuine public-private partnership with the public and private sectors working collaboratively together. And there are certain things, no regrets things, which government can really push forward. So we start to see that on permitting. So some of the grid reforms which the Chancellor pushed through in November of last year will help how we cut the queue down for projects where there are huge waiting times, we know, to deploy energy infrastructure. But also, I think also just an acknowledgement that nascent technology has a huge amount of risk up front. And there are some technologies, like nuclear, or certainly large-scale nuclear, which absolutely needs government support. And for example, Sizewell C probably can only really ever sit on the government's balance sheet. So I think across the energy infrastructure spectrum, you need that real, true partnership and then clear policy and regulatory frameworks to drive clean tech projects forward.
Thank you. Adam, can I turn to you from Google? We see one of the clear and obvious benefits of green technologies in the digital space at the moment, not only providing the data that's needed for companies and organizations to be able to deliver on calculating their emissions reductions and their various scopes. But I guess there's another side to the coin. And when we look at how to tackle disinformation and challenges to the transition, the role of digital technology and AI, are there any potential downsides that you view that need to be addressed in order to progress at pace for the future?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and morning, everyone. So maybe if I start with the opportunity for AI in this space. So sustainability has been a core value for Google since the company was founded, but this question of how we build technology to help in the fight against climate action has only got more urgent for obvious reasons. And we really do think we can help lead this transition in two particular ways. One, by making information accessible and useful, and by driving forward innovation. And we are particularly excited about the role of AI. So AI is obviously become very popular in the last couple of years. If you were using Google Search 5 years ago, Google Maps 6 years ago, you were using AI. So we've been in the AI space for many, many years. But actually the breakthroughs we're seeing now are really accelerating the opportunity in the climate space. And we actually worked with BCG the back end of last year to look at this. We identified, just based on existing use cases and technologies, so not the breakthroughs we're going to see next week, next month, next year, there's an opportunity by 2030 to reduce emissions globally by up to 10%. 10% is the emissions of the EU, to put that in perspective. And there are three particular areas we see opportunity: around information, around prediction, and around optimization. So just to give three quick examples, one area we've been working on is with the aviation sector. So flying may not be the most sustainable form of travel, but sometimes it is required. And actually, after fuel, the next biggest impact is contrails. So those thin white lines you often see behind flights, they account for about 35% of the emissions from the aviation sector. We've been using AI. We've partnered with American Airlines and Breakthrough Energy, and we're using AI and geospatial data to predict when contrails will occur. We tested this last year. We were able to reduce contrails by 54%. So a huge reduction, and we're now piloting this in EU airspace with Eurocontrols. Another area we've been working on in the energy sector is on methane. So we've been partnering with EDF, the Environmental Defence Fund. Methane is the second biggest atmospheric pollutant after CO2, accounts for around 30% of warming. And methane, as the main component in natural gas, can often leak from oil and gas infrastructure. So EDF, a couple of months ago, launched a new satellite into space that will orbit around 15 times a day. They're using our cloud computing and our geospatial data to, number one, spot where methane is leaking from. And then at Google, we're using our geospatial and Google Earth capabilities to map oil and gas infrastructure around the world, and we'll be making available where that infrastructure is and where those leaks are happening. So a huge opportunity there. Those two are really about mitigation, but I think adaptation is really important here. So just to talk around one example around our work in flood forecasting. So flooding, one of the biggest impact areas, affecting 250 million people a year or so. We're using AI to predict riverine flooding. We've been working on this a number of years. The technology's got so good now, we can predict riverine flooding up to 7 days in advance. We're doing that around 80 countries around the world. And actually, because of the improvements in technology, we're able to deploy this in parts of the world where the data's just been really scarce, often the parts of the world that are most impacted by this. So we're really able to deploy that, and that's helping aid agencies, governments, and individuals around the world. So those are just some of the examples. But I think your question as well was around the risks around some of this. And I think, lots we could talk about. One that people come and talk to me a lot around is around energy use. And you hear a lot in the news around what AI is going to need in terms of energy use. I think the reality is we're at an inflection point. No one really knows. But actually, Google's been working on this topic for many, many years. So a Google data center is about 1.5 times more efficient than a typical enterprise data center. Put that in perspective, compared to 5 years ago, we have 3 times as much compute power for the same amount of energy. But we're also very focused on the clean energy transition. We're one of the largest buyers of clean energy around the world. We've been matching our energy use with renewable energy since 2017, but we're actually going further now. We're aiming for something called 24/7 carbon-free energy. So we want to source clean energy locally every single hour of every single day. So there's lots more I could talk about in terms of efficiency of models, new chipsets we're bringing out, but just to give you a bit of a flavour of some of the work we're doing here. But we take it very seriously.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn now to that question I brought up in my introduction around the deployment of capital and the barriers to how capital can be deployed for green technologies. Rowan, what do you see as some of the greatest barriers in organisations that you work with at Howden that are stopping the deployment of capital from taking place?
Oh, it's very simple. It's the perception of risk, and often the perception of risk not necessarily being an accurate reflection of true risk, but also how we manage and govern that risk. So, as I mentioned in my earlier intervention, insurance is sometimes not really seen as part of finance, but it absolutely is. I mean, if we were to imagine one of the nearby skyscrapers being built, for the first 2 years you don't see anything except a hole in the ground, and then it quickly kind of builds. And the hole of the ground is actually insurance, if I can put it like that. It was the foundation of the capital stack. Insurance is simply an option on capital if something goes wrong. And it can be formally insurance, it can be cat bonds, it can be all sorts of mechanisms. But basically it says, if a defined event occurs, you get a chunk of change. And it deals with big issues that are absolutely foundational. Natural catastrophe risk, political risk, all the insurance against technology failure. The real fundamentals upon which investors and creditors need to sort of almost set aside and have dealt with, and they can deal with the risks they're concerned about. And what we see in this area is, at one level, a lack of understanding and consciousness about, say, a set of physical risks, which can be managed with all sorts of governance as well as transactions. I'll give you an example. At the moment, real challenge in rolling out solar across parts of the US and elsewhere because of actually natural hazard risk. It's a kind of a transition natural hazard challenge. So solar wind farms are getting whacked by big hailstorms, and the risk is very high, lots of losses. What are we going to do? It's very simple. We build slightly stronger solar panels which can tilt vertically when we get a nice forecast from our friends at Google. You tilt the solar panels vertically, they're tougher, you insure them through parametric insurance, takes out that risk, then re-engages and liberates the capital. Same with big wind farms. There's a huge advantage to make bigger windmills. I think efficiency improves at a square of the wingspan of the windmills, but that becomes more technologically challenging. or we have in the carbon markets, it's a bit of a Wild West. Insurance is governance. So we're now beginning to insure in voluntary carbon markets so that actually the quality of those credits is insured over a long period of time, and that way they become bankable and investable. Finally, we're going to be talking about the key technologies. I used to be, I'll confess my sins, I used to be a bit sniffy about CCS. Wondered if it was really, something that was going to be, should be and could be mainstream. I was corrected a couple of years ago when I went to a meeting on CCS, which was chaired by Nick Stern, so I thought, okay, maybe it is all right. And I've realized through being educated that there was going to have to be a dash for CCS. Fine. Actually, what really then is a matter is how do you then guarantee the long-term sequestration of the carbon underground to ensure that investors have confidence in the credits and the tax breaks. Really proud that Howden was able to orchestrate the first long-term insurance policies to secure that in the last few months with help from our carrier partners in Lloyd's at SCOR and Liberty. So exciting times. We will need to do the same for the hydrogen economy, which is so significant but frankly far more risky. So the key is to marry science, policy and regulation, and capital. And my contention, my passionate belief, is insurance is the form of capital that needs to provide that foundational form of governance upon which creditors and investors can then invest with relative confidence. The analogy here in the UK is banks don't really have to worry about flood risk. Why? Because they subcontract that to the insurance sector, require people to buy insurance, and it's the insurance sector that acts as the agent, economic agent, to drive demand for flood defences and help create flood re and all those things. We need to learn that, relearn that lesson, and propagate it across this transition.
John, you mentioned Breakthrough Energy, the 110 companies you've been working with, helping to provide investment from seed funding to Series B. What do you see as some of the greatest barriers for then those companies to expand further on, and what needs to be done to help that transition?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as Rowan said, he mentioned carbon capture and storage. I mean, what we're facing here with the energy transition is a massive amount of capex. Traditionally with fossil fuels, they're generally OPEX. Now to meet 2050, or here in the UK 2035 or 2030, to decarbonise the power sector, that's going to require a huge amount of capital investment. And let's be honest, a large part of that has to be driven by private sector capital. It can't all be done by the public sector balance sheet, especially when not just the UK but across Europe there is minimal fiscal headroom. So I think how we create those genuine partnership models, particularly as then we go to first of a kind and commercialise these projects, we're very good in Europe at innovating, but we need to really master this issue of then translating that into commercially deployable projects of first of a kind and de-risk them. And then you can bring in the institutional investors and the pension funds and debt and equity then to really drive those projects, but only once they are de-risked. I saw a statistic last week from Bloomberg NEF. We need 34 trillion of capital by 2050. I mean, it's huge amounts of capex. So you need the private sector, but you also need government to then take some of those really difficult risks.
Heather, can I turn to you? It would be remiss of me not to mention the US's role with the Inflation Reduction Act and the huge public investment that's also drawing in even more private investment into green technologies. How do you see the Inflation Reduction Act sort of changing the dynamics of the market and the opportunities it's bringing for developing green technology?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So we have the Inflation Reduction Act, and we also have, along with it, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which both work in the United States to make clean energy cheaper and more abundant, and to help our other countries go further, farther, faster in their own clean energy economies. It's kind of adhering to this concept that our clean energy transition will be government-enabled and private sector-led. So we will support knowledge sharing between countries. We're eager partners looking to build on progress that other countries have made. I know in my role here at the Energy Attaché, we have the US-UK Strategic Energy Dialogue, and we always tell the United Kingdom we have so much to learn from you and already your great deployment of renewable sources. And in this role as Attaché, I represent the US Department of Energy. We've received a lot of money from the bipartisan infrastructure law. And just when we're looking at technologies, we've always had our system of 17 national laboratories. Now we're looking through this legislation at being more than just a developer, but also a deployer of these technologies. And we do that through, we have an Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, which helps provide proof of concept, and it specifically does demonstrations in disadvantaged areas of America. And then we also have our Office of Technology Transfer, which tries to provide that key linkage between developing our technologies at our national labs or with partnerships with universities or other organizations, between that and the incubator stage and the kind of business development stage, which is a kind of a key part where these technologies can be lost. We also have our Loan Programs Office, which helps support more clean energy technology development. So we believe that the Inflation Reduction Act's impacts won't just be, of course, confined to the US. It has provisions that will contribute to the growth of the clean energy sector globally. And we've been really pleased to see other countries adopt some bold plans to encourage greater clean energy investment. And I think it's important to note that the Inflation Reduction Act presents opportunities for foreign direct investment in the US clean energy economy, and that there are specific tax credits for companies from our foreign allied nations that can take advantage of. And there are funds from our Loan Programs Office to finance deployment of clean energy technology in the United States that are available for projects owned by foreign headquartered firms and foreign firms in a joint venture with the US. So the project can also receive this loan program funding in addition to IRA tax credits. So I would say there's a lot of spearmint of advantages for the US and for the consumer, but also a lot of opportunities for growth globally.
And if I could just follow up on that point around international partnerships, I guess, and Rowan mentioned it in his fascinating historical lesson, around the issue around whose technologies, whose standards. We're in a net zero race. There will be winners, but there might be also losers. And how do we ensure other countries aren't forced down a road of adopting technologies that have been designed and built by other countries? How do we make sure that there is a just transition when it comes to green technologies? If you've got any thoughts on the role that the US can play in that?
Right, so that is a really important question to ask, because I think previous energy transitions weren't focused on that at all and left whole communities behind, and now we are focused on that both domestically and globally. So I would say that Department of Energy, we're very committed to this just transition. I'll start internationally and then I'll bring it back home, because I don't think we can be telling the world what to do without implementing those things where we also live. So we're progressing our goals through international fora like the Clean Energy Ministerial. The United States co-leads the Empowering People Initiative, which specifically addresses skills transitions needed to both facilitate the scale of the clean energy transition and ensure workers are prepared to take on this challenge. Especially those from the legacy energy communities that have powered our world through the last century and more. And in the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, in this forum, the economies have agreed to launch a Just Energy Transition Initiative among the APEC energy ministers, and the ministers have endorsed a set of Just Energy Transition principles to guide the initiative. But of course, change begins at home, and this really is a big priority. At home, the Department of Energy leads an interagency working group on coal and power plant communities and economic revitalization among federal agencies that creates good-paying union jobs, spurs economic revitalization, and supports energy workers in coal, oil, gas, and power plant communities across the country. I think this is particularly relevant as we look forward, we look at technology, we look ahead, we have to think about who we're leaving behind. I'm from Pennsylvania. It used to be a big coal state. It was the first state where oil was first discovered in America. It was part of the fracking revolution. And as these things come and go, you see communities just completely left behind with nothing there for it. Everyone has to leave. And so kind of focusing on not only where we're going, but who got us there is going to be a key part of this. So in that vein, Department of Energy and the wider federal government has the Justice 40 initiative, which establishes the goal of 40% of the overall benefits from federal investments, certain federal investments that will flow to disadvantaged communities. And there's a whole methodology on what consists of a disadvantaged community. So this Justice 40 initiative applies to Department of Energy. We've received $62 billion through the bipartisan infrastructure law, and the majority of that will be implemented under Justice 40 initiatives. And that also includes what, as I mentioned previously, this Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, which specifically shows these proof of concept demonstrations in disadvantaged communities to make sure that these benefits are reaching everyone.
Thank you very much. Adam, can I turn to you? Google, a huge global footprint, opportunity for private sector to play its role in a just transition. Have you got any thoughts on how do we ensure that no one is left behind?
Absolutely, and it's hugely important. And when we think about AI more generally, I'm obviously focused on the climate space, but we talk about being both bold and responsible, and we've spoken about the boldness in terms of the opportunity, responsible in terms of making sure we're taking care of the downside risks. But we also speak about doing it together, and that's both the sort of who the people we need to partner with. I gave examples earlier from Breakthrough to EDF, but many other partners we work with, including others in the room, because it's really only together we can make the progress we need. But also it's about this: how do we make sure that everyone can benefit from this opportunity? And there's a number of ways in which we do that. So one is through infrastructure. How do we make sure we're getting the right infrastructure on the ground in the right places? Whether that's data centers, whether that's investing in clean energy. We, for example, are investing in 5 gigawatts of clean energy in our supply chain in parts of the world where there just isn't the progress, isn't necessarily the political will, so places like parts of Asia and what have you. So we really want to make sure the right infrastructure's there. It's really important we make that technology available. So I gave examples earlier, but many others, from wildfire detection to routing, to many other things where we want to make that available around the world. And we're really invested in making sure the technology can work in those locations, working with the right partners. And as an example, we opened a number of years ago an AI development center in Ghana because we want with the right expertise on the ground to help develop those solutions. But we also help philanthropically as well through google.org, whether that, for example, is our Environmental Justice Data Fund, where we've got millions of philanthropic dollars going to NGOs to help in terms of data around air quality, water quality, etc. But also around the skills. So we're investing a lot through our AI Opportunities Fund around the world, including here in the UK, to help others make sure they've got the right skills and understanding so they can spot the opportunity and leverage this technology as well.
Great. I'm going to now open up to some of the questions we've got before returning to the panel to give a sort of summary thought on what they see as some of the opportunities ahead of COP29. So just keep that question in the back of your heads at the moment. Greg Watson has asked, for a faster scale-up, should investment stewards be encouraging their large company investments to partner better with scale-ups? So, John, I think that's one for you. If I could turn to you, maybe. Should investment stewards be encouraging their large company investments to partner better with scale-ups?
Absolutely. I think it's, as I said, the full ecosystem that, corporates who've got that, the deep pools of capital, but also that experience and the management structures that they can really then provide that coaching and pastoral care for those startups to really then take those forwards. We have something what we call the Panellists fund, which is a $1 billion fund, which really then takes those sort of Series B level companies to first of a kind and to commercialize their projects. And I think that's something that also corporates can do. So I think it's how you create that ecosystem where there are synergies clearly for corporates, but then also for startups. Yeah.
Rowan, I've got a question on insurance. There's still a reticence by insurers to underwrite renewables. How could we change this?
There's a reticence because we're not necessarily managing the risk across those renewables as well as we could collectively. So, as I said, there are we all want to drive renewables quickly. Ironically, some of the technologies, some of the locations, some of the politics around that becomes challenging. And just as we had to manage urban fires in the 1870s and 1880s by agreeing some rules of the game that would manage that risk structurally, as well as behaviours of the people actually operating and developing these facilities. So there is no shortage of desire to underwrite renewables. I will say that we're about to drive Howden is about to drive a campaign for the insurance sector to truly scale up at the speed and scale needed in the next 5 or 6 years. So I will say that we definitely need to put the accelerator button on, but actually it's not just about insurance. It's about insurance acting as that means to help shape what is sustainable and manageable risk that we can then really drive forward on. So I would say, and we need to think about insurance more broadly. There is going to be a need to, I mean, most insurance, 25% of global GDP is spent on insurance. We don't call it that, we call it welfare, social insurance. It's often funded through taxation. We need to think of how public, private and mutual systems are going to work, as well as liberating more sources of capital from financial markets through new, well, relatively new techniques in terms of parametrics and cat bonds and insurance-linked securities to find new ways of bringing more capital in. But an absolutely critical challenge. As Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados says, you know, countries or I guess technologies that aren't insurable are not investable. So we need to think how to de-risk these technologies so that they're competitive.
Thank you. We're coming, unfortunately, to the end of the time for the panel session. So I'm going to ask the panelists to think about what they see as the opportunities for green technology, innovation in this space, what needs to be announced at COP29, ideally, or into COP30. And we'll start for John and run backwards. So, John.
I'll be brief. I mean, look, there's a huge amount of innovation out there. It's incredibly exciting, you know, working with some of the companies out there. I'll sound like a bit of a stuck record, I suppose. I think in the short term, if you're talking, you know, to 2029, actually seeing governments get on with real technocratic reforms. So we see, for example, what the CFD mechanism's done here in the UK, which has allowed offshore wind to really flourish. If you see those type of mechanisms, if we can apply that to the more nascent tech sectors, I think we can really start to move forward. So I think that is around grid planning, grid reform, how, you know, we're going to have to triple or quadruple our electricity supply over the next 30 years. So how do you get that ecosystem, as I said, to really drive those reforms? I think that is key, if a bit boring.
Adam, any thoughts on priorities from Google?
I mean, I think one of the things that always worries me when we talk about technology is it can sound like some distant hope that we might strive to get, and we all need to innovate and we might get there. I think, you know, we have the technologies today, the IPC has said this, we just need to deploy them. So I think it's about scale, pace and deployment.
And Heather, obviously, US will be playing a key role at COP29 into COP30. Any thoughts on where you see priorities emerging?
So right now, we're working with the Azerbaijani host to make sure that not only is finance a key part of the next COP29, but also that there is a strong focus on technology. And so we are working with our host to make sure that the technology part, not just the finance part, is profiled there. And then, of course, we have our Clean Energy Ministerial and Mission Innovation to try to implement that. But we need that kind of focus on the technology.
Thank you. Rowan, you mentioned about the work that Howden's been doing, launching the role of insurance in de-risking technologies. Is there anything that you'll be focusing on ahead of COP29? Yeah,
there are two things, actually. Last week, at the invitation of the SMI, I was lucky enough to be at the once every 10 years Small Island Developing States big UN conference in Antigua. It was a tough gig last week. But what was exciting there is we were propagating some research that we're now putting into practice with the help of the SMI and actually the Commonwealth. So it's great to see Baroness Scotland here later. We did the analysis and to actually insure these small island developing states against the natural catastrophes that they face, which can take out well more than 100% of their GDP overnight. These countries are absolutely insurable if we manage the relationship between this square mile and the wider global risk capital markets, donor governments, and the CIS governments themselves. We can ensure that these countries do not face the financial wipeout that they do face, and then they become investable. So that's one aspect. But the other aspect is, you know, we've heard about the public policy in the US, obviously IRA, we've had echoes of that in Europe. As we're in the midst of an election here, we see that the parties all talking in some ways about, you know, an integrated industrial and policy, and the Labour Shadow Chancellor talks about securonomics, which is a concept as an insurer I find very, very interesting in terms of reframing the sort of work that insurance has to do. So it's great to see John here from the British Chamber of Commerce in Azerbaijan. working with him and others to really see, and Anthony Hobley, if we can make an insurance breakthrough at this COP with the help of potentially the climate champions, because for our sector, we need to re-engage and reposition ourselves. And I can't think of a better theme than climate for our sector to rise up and meet its challenge.
Well, thank you to our panel for so expertly and engagingly talking about the opportunities, but also the barriers of the role of green technology in delivering the net zero transition. Thanks to everyone for being so engaging in this session. Thanks to everyone who's been watching on the live stream as well. But please do give a round of applause to the panel. Thank you.